Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So I'm going to be doing a vampire books recommendation video for you today, which is going to kind of apply to the Spooktober readathon. If you are in my clan for that readathon and you need a book that has vampires in it, this is the video to come to. But it's also been a very long time since I have done a recommendations video, and mainly that's because of all of the lists that I have running for recommendations. I haven't read through all of the books that I would like to talk about, but when it comes to vampire books, I have pretty much read the selection. Like, I have been reading vampire books since I was way too young to be reading vampire books. Like, pre-Twilight, I read through every single vampire book that I could get my hands on. Whether it was in the teen section, whether it was in the adult section, I just read everything that I could. Vampires are just dark and mysterious and sexy, and they're appealing to read about. So I've broken this video down into multiple parts for you guys. So I have different sections based on what type of book you are looking for or what type of reader you are. So I'm gonna go through some of the classic vampire stories that everybody kind of should have read at this point. Spin-offs of those, kind of more modern famous vampire authors that fall more into the paranormal romance genre, and then getting into lighthearted vampire stories, horror stories, and YA. So if any of those sound interesting to you, I will leave timestamps down in the description of when I switch from one section to another, so if you only want to listen to like maybe horror recommendations, you can jump to a certain minute mark, etc. You get the idea. So first, I am of course going to start with the classic vampire stories that kind of just kicked the whole genre off way back in like the 1800s. We're talking about Dracula by Bram Stoker. It's basically what kicked off the entire fictionalized character that is the vampire. So if you haven't read Dracula yet, now might be a good time. Then of course there is the famous Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, or literally almost anything that Anne Rice has written. Anne Rice kind of paved the way for modern classic horror. So anything in that whole series, there's like The Vampire Lestat, there's Queen of the Damned, there's endless vampire books by Anne Rice. And again, she's just kind of like a modern classic vampire writer, so if you haven't read anything by her, I recommend checking something out at some point. It's worth it. And if we're talking about other modern classic type authors, we of course have Stephen King, who is like the king of horror novels, but Salem's Lot is technically his first vampire story, and I was again too young when I read this book and it scared the pants off of me. But it's also a pretty lengthy and in-depth story about the town in general. Like, there's only a few actual scary moments in that. It's just a lot of backstory on the town. So if that's your jam, go for it. If not, move on to a different horror story. And then the last one that I'm going to consider kind of a pivotal classic vampire story is called Let the Right One In by John Ajvide Lindqvist. This also was turned into a movie somewhat recently. I mean, I use that term relatively, it wasn't that recent, but it's one of the best movies that I've ever seen, and it's totally worth reading the book just for the adaptation purposes, but this is such a creepy and well done vampire story. It's not gonna follow the classic plot lines. It's so good. So I highly recommend checking this out, because in my mind that's kind of a classic vampire story as well. Now moving in to kind of stories that I don't want to call spin-offs, but they were definitely written because of the original Dracula story. So the first two that I want to talk about are Dracula the Undead, which is written by Dacre Stoker, who is actually the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker. So he is the actual descendant of the original author of Dracula. So this is a direct sequel to Dracula, like it follows the events that took place. And he also wrote the book called Dracul, which is a prequel to Dracula. So if you want to read more of that actual storyline, there's two more books technically. There are also a lot of spin-off stories that follow Mina. Mina Harker is like one of the main characters in the original Dracula stories. So there's a book called Mina by Elaine Bergstrom, which is worth checking out. I recommend that one. There's also Dracula My Love by Siri James, and I believe there's another one called Dracula in Love. I don't remember the author of that one, but that just popped into my head while I'm filming it. I believe all of those technically follow Mina. The last book that I want to talk about that is directly related to the Dracula story is The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. This follows more of the mythology and the history surrounding Dracula, so it's a lot denser, but it's definitely worth reading. This is a really, really solid book. If you can like plow your way through it, maybe not for a readathon, but just in general, if you're curious, I highly recommend this book. Okay, and taking a very different turn, we are going to get into like the pivotal authors that are in adult paranormal romance that kind of paved the way after Anne Rice laid the groundwork. So obviously when we think of vampire stories now, because of the show True Blood, we are thinking of the Sookie Stackhouse series by Charlene Harris. This is like a, I don't don't know how many books long at this point. It's in the teens, but it is an on-running, southern, kind of gothic vampire story. If you haven't watched True Blood, I highly recommend it. It's very entertaining, but these are the books that they are based off of. We also have J.R. Ward coming in strong in the vampire game with the Black Dagger Brotherhood series. I am just about to start these, so I can't personally recommend them to you, but they have been recommended to me time and time again. If you like sexy time vampires, this is apparently the series to read, and it is also many books long. We also have another beloved author in kind of the paranormal horror genre, which is Laurell K. Hamilton, who wrote the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series, which I think that one's really long too. For some reason, all these authors, they wrote books and books and books, so if you fall in love with book one, you got many to go. And we have the Dark Hunter series by Sherilyn Kenyon. Sherilyn Kenyon kind of has just all types of romance covered, including paranormal romance, so if you like her writing, there's a lot of Sherilyn Kenyon books out there for you. And moving into more lighthearted books, a lot of these are not super dark and brooding vampires, like the Sookie Stackhouse ones are generally more lighthearted. So sticking in that vein, we're gonna move into Christopher Moore, who is kind of like his own genre. He writes like comedy horror. He has a very like stylistic cover, so I'm sure you've picked up some of these over the years. They are hilarious. I highly recommend them if you want like a much lighter read that is not as horror based. These will definitely give you a chuckle. We also have Mary Janice Davidson, who kind of has the same type of genre locked down, but more for female audiences. I feel like Christopher Moore is kind of a universal writer, like they appeal to men and women. Davidson, I think, writes more like cutesy stories. She writes the Undead And series. Like all of her books start with Undead and something something something. You'd probably recognize those as well, but those are, again, more lighthearted vampire stories. And you guys will be able to guess where I'm going to transition into with this last comedy recommendation. So, if you guys haven't read Nightlight yet, this is made by the Harvard Lampoon, which makes like parody type books. This is great. If you guys are like me and you got oversaturated with the whole Twilight phenomenon that happened, this book just pokes fun at every single trope or little nuance that happens in the Twilight series. It's very short. If you haven't picked this up yet, I highly recommend it because I laughed through the whole thing. It was so funny. So obviously, I'm going to transition into the YA paranormal vampire books, which is where I am the most well-versed because I first discovered my love of vampires when I was probably like 10 to 12 years old, which means my books of choice were the teen section. So obviously, we're gonna kick things off with Twilight. I still have my full set, there is no shame in liking them. These books, while they might not be great literature, they were guilty pleasure reads, and they really kicked off the whole YA book community as a whole. Like, as much as you want to trash Twilight, they really got the YA community going. So, I mean, you can always reread Twilight if you want to. I am scared to do it at this point because I remember enjoying them when I was 14, and they were relevant and good at the time, and I'm terrified to go back and read what they are now. We also have the classic Vampire Academy and the Bloodline spin-off trilogy by Richelle Mead. I actually haven't read these. I had the box set sitting on my shelves forever and I eventually sold them, and now I'm kind of regretting it. I feel like that's a pivotal series that everybody loved, so maybe I will pick them up again at some point, but we shall see, but I know these are very beloved. As is the House of Night series by PC and Kristen Cast. I devoured these books. These were one of those series that I remember going to the store and purchasing 4 or 5 at a time just so that I could binge through them. These were kind of the very start of more mature YA because it definitely deals with slightly more graphic content in it, and it was like revolutionary for me at the time. As like an older teen reading these, there was actual sex in the books and it blew my mind. So if you guys haven't picked these up, I highly recommend them. There's a lot. There are many, many books in this series, but I mean, you can read through them in a day, so it goes super fast. Going back to like classic YA vampire stories, we have the Vampire Diaries, which I am currently actually rewatching the show right now because I technically never finished the show when it was on. So surprisingly, I'm actually watching the show currently, and you know what? I'm loving it. It is such a guilty pleasure show, but I definitely remember reading these books by L.J. Smith back in the day, and they are very different from the show. I remember that much. But I believe technically the bind-ups of the Night World books also include vampires. I didn't read those. I read the Vampire Diaries. I enjoyed them at the time. So, I don't know if they hold up for the test of time, but I'm still liking the show, so I mean the story is still a-okay. We're going old school with a lot of these recommendations, guys, because these are the books that I personally grew up on, so we're gonna flash back to like the early 2000 vampire days, because that's when all the good books were out. So we have the Blue Blood series by Melissa De La Cruz. We have the Morganville Vampire books by Rachel Kane. Loved those. A lot of them came out. There were many. We have the Vampire Kisses by Ellen Schreiber. I loved these as well. I'm pretty sure I still have these somewhere in my house. Pretty much anything by Amelia Atwater Rhodes. I remember reading Demon in My View. That was one of the very first vampire books that I ever read, and that's kind of what started the love for me. There's the Evernight series as well by Claudia Gray, who you guys know Claudia Gray now because of Defy the Stars and the 1,000... oh god. Okay, what are 1,000 Skies Above You? I feel like I just combined words from multiple titles. That might be it. The covers with the like dimensional travel with all the like splashy, colorful covers. Do you know what I'm talking about? But she is a very well-known author now, but she wrote a vampire kind of like school type story that I loved. And I highly recommend the Evernight series. I definitely really enjoyed those. There's the Chronicles of Vladimir Todd by Heather Brewer. Do you guys remember these covers? They were good. I really liked these books. Like, the covers don't really do them justice, but these were really, really good. And somewhat more recently, we have the Immortal Rules series by Julie Kagawa, who is like moving on to bigger and better things at this point, but this was a very interesting take on vampires. Very unique, very good. So that's all I'm gonna do for the YA paranormal romance section. I could literally go on forever. Like, I'm pretty sure I have an entire tote bin downstairs full of literally just vampire books, because that is all that I read as a teenager. So I could go on and on and on, but those are kind of like the main series that I wanted to hit on that I feel like everybody grew up reading that are really good. I still recommend checking them out. And I'm gonna take a very different turn, and I'm going to move into actual horror stories, like books that scared the pants off of me, or that are dark horror stories that I didn't expect to have vampires in it. Like, you don't realize the monsters you're dealing with are technically considered vampires until you're like deep into the story and you're like, wait, they're drinking blood. So the first one that I want to recommend is one of my favorite series of all time, and that is The Passage by Justin Cronin. This is a trilogy. All 3 books are out. They are dense books. They are like thick, long stories that you kind of need to dedicate time to, but god, are they worth it. They are so good and they are so creepy. It's done so well. I highly recommend this series. Another book that has been turned into a show is the Strain series by Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan. These, I remember listening to these as audiobooks, and they scared the bejesus out of me. Like, I was listening to them while I was at work with headphones in, and like my boss would walk up behind me to say something to me, and I would just like lose my shit because it would scare the crap out of me. This book kind of embodies jump scares in horror movies really well. Like, I don't know how they do it in book form, but oh man, it's effective. This one is also like super graphic, so if maybe you're not into as much gory stuff, maybe avoid that one, but if you're into really disturbing shit, this is a series to check out. Another kind of modern classic vampire story is called Fledgling by Octavia E. Butler. This is another book that I probably read way too young, but oh man, it's dark, it's gross, and it's really good. Some like classic horror vampire stories that people may not have heard of. Carmilla, which is like dealing with a lady vampire, which is great, and especially for like the time period that this came out. This is by J. Sheridan LaFanu, I believe, and it was really good. Kind of hard to get through, but definitely worth reading. We also have Children of the Night by Dan Simmons, and I think he writes a lot of horror, and I think there's another one called Carrion something along those lines. I didn't read that one, but I read Children of the Night. Yeah, he's good at horror, needless to say. There is Those Who Hunt the Night by Barbara Hambly. This is another like kind of classic if you're gonna get into like the culture of vampire books. This one and Lost Souls by Poppy Z. Bright. Both of those I feel like are classic stories that you like need to read to like really immerse yourself in vampire culture. They're really good, very dark and creepy, but different. Like, they're not the standard Dracula type of story. And the last book that I'm gonna recommend, I personally haven't read, and now I really want to, so I might pick it up, is called Fever Dream by George R.R. Martin. Yeah, Game of Thrones dude wrote a vampire story called Fever Dream. I didn't know that, so I just want to recommend it to you guys because it's George R.R. Martin, which means there's gonna be a lot of death and mayhem in a vampire story by him, so I'm very intrigued by it. So that was a long video. That was many recommendations. So for everybody who stuck with me to the end of this video, congratulations, you were diehard vampire fans. Like I said, I have just been reading vampire books for like decades at this point. It's been so long. I just adore the genre, and I'm kind of anxious for new vampire stories to come out, because I talked about this with a lot of you guys in a previous video with like what trends are coming. I would love to see paranormal romance make a comeback. Like, we oversaturated the market with Twilight vampires and werewolves and whatnot, and now I feel like we have enough writers on the market who write really good, creepy horror stories that I would love to see a more modern story done on vampires that is not sparkly and romantic, that's actually dark and gruesome. So I would love to see new stories like that coming out. So if any of you guys have recommendations for me, definitely leave them down in the comments, because I just barely brushed the surface that is vampire books. There are just so many out there, but I feel like those are the main classics that you should read from each of the like genres that I covered. So that is going to be it for this video. I hope you guys got some good recommendations, and I'll see you guys in my next one.